I rise to speak in this debate really for several reasons. I applaud the fact that the Minister is taking this debate and the fact that the Secretary of State is not here. That's not something you usually say, but given the task the Secretary of State is engaged with and his focus on that, I think that is welcome. I fear, though, I share the Minister's hope that the talks conclude with a positive outcome, and prior to next Monday's deadline, we can see an agreement to restore the executive in Northern Ireland, because it is, I think, unquestionably the case that devolved government is the right long-term solution for Northern Ireland. But I do say to the Minister, and I listened carefully to what he said about the options available to the Secretary of State, I do think that the government and this House and all of the parties in Northern Ireland, more of whom are now represented in this House than was the case prior to December's election, we all owe collectively a duty to the people of Northern Ireland to make sure that that part of the United Kingdom is properly governed. And I fear, and I say this partly to the Minister but also to those parties in Northern Ireland, if by next Monday we don't see an ability to restore the Stormont Executive, I don't think, for reasons I will set out in a moment, that the option of either kicking the can down the road by extending the deadline or indeed having another Assembly election, I'm afraid is going to be up to the task. And I fear we will be confronting a binary choice of either getting the Assembly up and running, but if not, I think we are going to have to some extent, have executive decisions taken by ministers accountable to this House. And let me just set out one area where I think that is necessary, and I pick up and follow on actually from what the Shadow Secretary of State said. I agree with what he said about the important health workforce issues in Northern Ireland, and I think the fact that health workers in Northern Ireland, nurses in Northern Ireland, are on strike is incredibly regrettable. But worse, I think, is the performance of the health service. And I think if I look at two particular factors, one is the length of time people are waiting for treatment. In England, in the last set of statistics, just over 1,000 people, 1,233 people were waiting more than a year for treatment, for seeing a consultant. In Northern Ireland, and I don't think I need to elaborate to many members of this House the difference in population sizes, the number of people waiting, I understand, for more than a year to see a consultant is 103,000 people. That's a third, over a third, of all of the people waiting for health treatment. And the cancer waiting times mean that a fifth of those people who receive a cancer diagnosis are receiving the cancer diagnosis in the emergency department of a hospital. And I don't know what the precise statistics are, but it seems very likely that thousands of people are therefore dying unnecessarily by not receiving timely health treatment. So I don't think it is an exaggeration to say that the lack of devolved government in Northern Ireland, where ministers accountable to the people of Northern Ireland are able to take the necessary decisions to reform the health service, to implement pay awards, to recruit the necessary staff, and to make sure the health service is running efficiently, is directly leading to the deaths, the unnecessary deaths, of people in Northern Ireland. And I don't think if we're unable to see a Stormont Executive and Assembly re-established next week, I don't think in good conscience we can allow that situation to continue if it means the early deaths of citizens of our own country, part of our own country. So I think that when ministers and the government are going to be faced with a very difficult decision, that if we don't see a restored executive and assembly, I don't think it's going to be a realistic option, unless we are literally on the cusp of an agreement, to just kick the can down the road again, extend the deadline, or have elections. And I've looked carefully at the result of the general election in Northern Ireland and looked at how that compares to the result of the last Assembly election, and it doesn't seem to me, looking at the difference of performance of the relevant political parties, that there's anything about an Assembly election taking place in the present political circumstances that's going to lead to an outcome that's going to enable the formation of an executive after an Assembly election that isn't capable of taking place next week. Of course, I'll give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Just when he's elaborating on that point, would he agree with me that however much people might relish an election, it is difficult to see in the current context, if an election were to be held, that the exposition of the problems that we've been faced with over the past 3 years would change to any degree, either before, during or after an Assembly election?
I agree with the honourable gentleman, and I said I've looked at the balance of opinion of the political parties, and it seems to me the exact number of seats that they might have would differ, but I think the broad order of ranking wouldn't change. And it also seems to me there's a danger that the issues which I won't elaborate on, that we know are the contentious ones that are preventing the coming together of the political parties to form an executive and to get the Assembly up and running, it seems to me the danger of an election is that that would cause those issues, people to dig in further and to be less capable of the necessary compromises, because parties will have staked out those positions in an election campaign. So all I would say, both to the Minister and to my valued colleagues from Northern Ireland, is I fear that we're approaching a decision point where, if the parties in Northern Ireland are unable to re-establish an executive and an assembly, I fear the government, at least in the short term, is going to have to come to this House with a proposition that some level of direct rule by Westminster ministers is going to be necessary. And I completely agree that is not the right long-term solution for Northern Ireland. But for the reasons I set out, if for no other reason than the performance of the health service, which I think is close to falling over, I don't think in good conscience we can allow that situation to continue. And the Shadow Secretary of State set out some other issues as well. So that is my first point. My second and final point was really to ask the Minister if he was able to furnish the House with any further details about progress on the legacy prosecution issues. I noticed in the report that officials were continuing during the general election campaign to work through options, and I recognise what he can say is probably limited, I think, from what he said before, because obviously we would only want to make progress with the agreement of a re-established executive and assembly, and therefore I accept that he won't be able to set out details. What I was hoping he could set out was the progress that had been made, at least in exploring the options, and some hint of a timetable that, if we were able to establish devolved government again, how quickly the government would be able to make progress on bringing forward an ability to resolve those legacy issues around prosecutions. Because clearly, for those individuals who are directly affected, whether in live cases or in worry about the future, some understanding of how quickly those issues may be brought to a conclusion would be welcome. So I think those are the two issues really that I wanted to bring in front of the Minister and the House, and also just to set them out in front of colleagues from Northern Ireland, because I think we are approaching a very grave decision point where I fear we may have to take some decisions with some very significant consequences for the future.